Chapter 15 of The Last Egyptian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ian Stewart, Rosanna, Victoria, Australia. The Last Egyptian by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 15. Chapter 15. Winston Bey is indignant. In their rooms at the Savoy next morning, Lord Roane and his son quarrelled violently. The day's paper contained a full account of the affair at the club, and while no names were mentioned, there was no misunderstanding who the culprit was. An English nobleman who had lately arrived to fill an important position in the Ministry of Finance was detected playing with marked cards and loaded dice by a well-known Egyptian gentleman of wealth and high station, who promptly exposed the fraud in the presence of several reputable club members. Fortunately, the Englishman's name had only been posted, and he had not yet been admitted to membership in the club, so that his trickery and consequent disgrace in no way reflects upon that popular and admirably conducted institution, etc. Lord Roane was vastly chagrined and indignant as he read the account. "You low, miserable scoundrel," he roared, facing his son. "How dare you drag the name of your family in the mire, just as we are assuming an indisputable position of respectability in Cairo? To be a gambler is despicable enough, but to become a common cheat and swindler is utterly unpardonable. What have you to say for yourself?" "Nothing," said Consinor sullenly. "I am innocent. It was a plot to ruin me." "Pah! A plot of yours to ruin others, rather. Speak up, man. Have you nothing to say to excuse or palliate your shame and dishonour?" "What use?" asked the Viscount apathetically. "You will not believe me." "Do you believe him, Aneth?" asked the old man, turning to gaze upon the girl's horrified face. "Do you believe that this cur, who is my son and your father, is innocent?" "No," she answered, shrinking back as Consinor looked up curiously to hear her reply. "He has deceived me cruelly. He promised me he would not touch a card again or play for money, and he has broken his word. I cannot believe him now." "Of course not," her father retorted, reddening for the first time. "My precious family is so rotten throughout that even its youngest member cannot give a Consinor credit for being honest or sincere. See here, Roger, I'll not have Aneth insulted even by you. I'm not a saint, I'll admit, but I've never been guilty of petty swindling, and your daughter is pure enough to shame us both. As for you, I've done with you, and you must from this time work out your salvation in your own way. You've dissipated any inheritance you might have had, but I'll give you £1,000 in cash if you'll take your ugly face out of Cairo and promise not to come near us again. I'll take care of your wife and daughter, neither of whom, I am positive, will miss you for a single hour." "It's a good offer," said Consinor quickly, "and I'll accept it. Where did you get the £1,000? "That," declared my lord stiffly, "is none of your accursed business. Now go. Leave your resignation with the Minister of Finance, and then make yourself scarce. Here, I'll write you a cheque now." Consinor took the paper. "If it is good, and the bank will cash it," he said slowly, "I'll do as I have agreed, and not trouble you again. Good-bye, Aneth. Look out for that snaky Egyptian who is following you around. He alone is responsible for this affair, and you cannot afford to trust him. And give my fond farewell to your mother. She won't mind if I do not appear in person to irritate her nerves." "Where will you go?" asked Lord Roane. "That, sir, to repeat your own words, is none of your accursed business." With this filial response he left the room, and Aneth burst into a flood of tears. Never had she felt so wretched and humiliated as at this discovery of her father's infamy, and although Roane tried to comfort his granddaughter by pointing out the fact that Roger had long been a gambler with a character not above suspicion, the girl had so fondly hoped for her father's regeneration that her disappointment was indeed bitter. "It won't hurt us so very much, my child," continued the old nobleman, stroking her head soothingly. "The world will know we have repudiated Roger, and will sympathize with our distress. In a few months the scandal will be forgotten, and we may again hold up our heads. I'm afraid I've lived a rather wicked life, my dear, but for your sake I would like to retrieve my good name and die possessed of the honour and respect of all my fellow men, and this, I believe, I can accomplish. Don't worry, little one. Be brave, and the blow will not hurt half so much." There were tears in his own eyes as he marked her distress, and he continued to encourage her until the young girl had partly recovered her self-control, and the first shock of her sudden misfortune had been blunted. Then he kissed her tenderly and went away to his office. The account in the morning paper had likewise caused Gerald Winston considerable amazement and dismay. His first thought was of Aneth and the trouble that had come to her. His next a feeling of resentment toward Kāra. After pacing the floor restlessly for an hour, he called for his saddle horse and rode down the Shubra road to interview the Egyptian at his villa. Kāra was at home, and received his visitor with cold politeness, which Winston passed unnoticed. He was not in a mood to be affected by trifles. "I understand that you accused Consinor of cheating at the club last night," he began impetuously. "Well?" said Kāra, lifting his brows inquiringly. "Why did you do it?" "Because it was true. He was robbing me." "You know what I mean, sir. You have been posing as a friend of Miss Consinor. To expose her father to public shame was the act of a cowardly enemy." "What would you have done in my place?" asked Kāra calmly. I would have concealed the discovery and allowed the man to go, refusing to play with him again," declared Winston. "And so have allowed him to rob others, perhaps?" "If necessary, yes, that his daughter's good name might be protected. But a private warning would have induced him to abandon further trickery." "He is an old offender, I believe," said Kāra, leaning back in his chair and regarding the other with an amused expression. "It might benefit you to reflect that Miss Consinor's good name has not been acquired on account of her father's respectability, any more than through the reputation of her grandsire, who has grown old in iniquity. Therefore I cannot believe that I have injured her in any way." A tinge of passionate hatred in the man's voice as he referred to Lord Roane aroused Winston's attention. Then suddenly a light broke upon him. "See here, Kāra," he said sternly, "are you persecuting these people and plotting against them because of the old wrong that Roane did your grandmother, Hatatcha?" "I am neither persecuting nor plotting against them," declared Kāra. "Consinor has ruined himself unaided. As for his daughter, I have every object in protecting her from scandal." "What do you mean by that, sir?" "I intend to marry her." At this cool statement Winston stared, aghast. Then he gave a bitter laugh. "That is absurd and impossible," he said. "Why so?" "You are cousins. She does not know that, and you will not tell her because you have so much regard for her grandfather's good name," with a sneer. "I see. It is your plot to ruin her, but it will fail because she will never consent to marry you," he continued. "How do you know that?" asked Kāra. "It is improbable that she can love you. In that, sir, I am inclined to differ with you. Even if Aneth discovered our relationship, it would not matter. In olden days our Egyptian kings married their sisters." "And I suppose that Lord Roane would emphatically deny the assertion that I am his grandson." "I would myself deny it, and you have no proof to back your statement of the fact." "You told me the story with your own lips." "To be sure, and the story was true. I do not mind acknowledging it at this moment because there are no witnesses present. But if you repeat the statement in public, I will deny it absolutely." For a moment Winston remained thoughtfully silent. Then he said, "You are proposing a dreadful crime, Kāra, but it will avail you nothing to defy morality in this way. There is another reason why Miss Consinor will refuse to marry you, and it is entirely distinct from the subject of your relationship." "To what do you refer?" "To the woman you are keeping even now in your harem. It is a matter of public scandal, and I am surprised that society has not already ostracized you for your audacious defiance of propriety. You are neither an Arab nor a Mohammedan. Doubtless the offence has not yet come to Miss Consinor's ears, but if it does, have you any idea she would place her happiness in the hands of a man of your character?" Kāra frowned. Here was a weapon against him that he had never before recognized. "I suppose you will take pains to inform Miss Consinor that I have a slave girl among my servants," he said, mockingly. "I shall ask Mrs. Everingham to tell her the truth concerning your domestic relations," returned Winston decidedly. The Egyptian arose. "I think it will be as well to end this interview, Winston Bey," he said. "You are yourself a pretender for the hand of my future bride, and it is useless to endeavor to fairly discuss matters wherein you are so selfishly concerned." "Do you choose to defy my warnings?" asked Winston, angrily. "By no means. I merely ignore your implied threats. They can in no way interfere with my plans." "I believe," said Winston, striving to control his indignation, "that those plans are inspired by hatred rather than love. I shall do my best to oppose them." "Naturally. It is your privilege, sir." Winston turned to go. "I shall always regret," he remarked bitterly as a parting shot, "that I was so foolish as to bring a filthy native from out the natural environment of his mud village." "The filthy native would have found other means of escape had you not brought him. So you need not reproach yourself," returned Kāra with a smile. "But the trifle you have mentioned should not be your deepest regret, my stupid Englishman." "Did I do anything more foolish?" "Yes." "What was it?" "You kicked me twice beneath the palms of Fedah." "Ah, I should not have restrained myself to 2 kicks." "Be content, sir. Twice was sufficient, since it is liable to cause you much unhappiness. I had it in mind, had you kicked me again, to kill you." Winston left the villa more thoughtful than he had been on his arrival. The matter involved much more, it seemed, than the loss of Lord Consinor's reputation. Kāra's confident tone had not failed to impress his rival, and the Englishman was more uneasy than he cared to admit even to himself. His love for Aneth was sincere and unselfish, and he could imagine no greater calamity for the girl than to acquire a fondness for the treacherous native whose presence he had just left. Such a contingency had not occurred to him before, and for this reason Kāra's claims were as startling as they were revolting. He longed to go to the girl at once and strive to comfort her in this her hour of sorrow, but a natural delicacy restrained him. She would like to be alone at first, until she had somewhat recovered from the humiliation she would be sure to suffer at the public exposure of her father's misdeeds. Afterward he could assure her of his confidence and friendship, and, when the proper time came, of his love. Meantime he contented himself by sending Aneth a basket of the most beautiful roses to be found in Cairo. No such delicacy of feeling influenced Kāra. In the afternoon he went to the Savoy and sent up his card. Aneth was alone, Mrs. Everingham having just left her for a drive. The girl received the Egyptian almost with eagerness. "Can you forgive me, Prince?" she asked by way of greeting as she stood before him with scarlet cheeks and downcast eyes. "Forgive you for what, Miss Aneth?" he replied gently. For the wrong my father did you," she stammered. Kāra smiled, and she glanced up shyly in time to catch his expression of amusement. "Let us sit down and talk it over," he said, taking her hand and leading her to a chair. "But it will be unnecessary, I am sure, for me to say that I have nothing to forgive, since you have in no way offended." "But my father," she began timidly, again dropping her eyes in shame. "Yes, I know, Miss Aneth," said he. "Your father did a foolish thing for which people will justly condemn him. I am very sorry that it was through me he was detected, but I assure you I was powerless to prevent it. Others saw the marked cards and forced the accusation against him. Believe me, I would have saved him if possible, but I could not." "I believe you, Prince Kāra," she said. "It was all my father's fault, and his punishment is only such as he deserved." "I am deeply grieved for your sake," continued Kāra, and indeed the sight of her sweet face, convulsed with anguish, so appealed to him at the moment that his speech was almost sincere. "I know what this disgrace will mean to you, Aneth. The avoidance of your former associates, and the jeers, perhaps, of those who have envied you. The world is heartless always, and visits the sins of the fathers upon their children, so that your innocence will not be considered save by your truest friends." He paused, for she was crying now, softly but miserably, and the tears moved him strangely. "That is why I have come," he continued, his voice trembling with earnestness, "to assure you of my faith in you and of my steadfast friendship. Nay, more, I offer to protect you against the sneers of all the world if you will grant me the right." The girl started, glancing nervously and almost affrightedly into his face. I do not understand you, Prince Kāra," she murmured. "Then I must speak more plainly," he quickly rejoined, springing up to stand before her with sparkling eyes and outstretched hands. "Aneth, my sweet one, I love you. To me you represent the joys of earth and the delights of paradise. Only in your presence do I find happiness and content. Be my wife, Aneth. Give me yourself, and I will guard you so well and place you so high that all the world will bow at your feet." The speech shocked her, for there was no mistaking the man's earnestness. Nor did she know how to reply, the proposal being as unexpected as it was inopportune. Aneth may have had vague dreams of love, as maidens will and should have, but she had been so happy in Cairo that she had not thought the attentions of Kāra meant more than the kindly good fellowship of the other men she had met. Indeed, she had not considered such a subject at all, and at this hour, when her heart was wrung with grief, she found in it no response to her suitor's fervid appeals. "I cannot reply to you just now, Prince Kāra," she said with hesitation. "It is all new to me and quite unexpected, and I do not wish to marry anyone." His face hardened as he gazed upon her timid, shrinking form, but the longing in his dark eyes remained. With all his lately acquired polish, the native failed to comprehend that an English girl does not yield herself to the demands of any man, unless her heart and inclinations lead her to acknowledge his authority. But he was wise enough to perceive that the difficulties of the situation required tact if he wished to succeed. "Aneth," said he more quietly, "this is no time for evasions or misunderstandings between us. I have told you that I love you, that my earnest desire is to make you my wife. You need a protector at this moment, and a delay is as foolish as it is dangerous to your interests. If you love me at all, you can tell me so today, as well as later." "Ah, that is it, Prince. I'm afraid that I do not love you in the way that you wish," answered the girl, aroused to a more dignified tone by his persistence. "I am very grateful to you, Prince Kāra, and appreciate the honor of your proposal, but I have nothing more to offer you than my sincere friendship." "Then I will accept that as sufficient for the time being," said he. "I will marry your friendship, Aneth, and perhaps the love will some time follow." "Oh, I cannot allow that," she cried, distressed. "I am sorry to hurt you when you are so kind to me, but can't you see that I am unnerved and unhappy today, and that if you force me to answer you, I can only say no?" He grew thoughtful at this, studying her features carefully. After a moment he replied, "I will not press the question further now, but will give you 2 days for consideration. Will you answer me at the end of that time?" She hesitated, knowing already what the answer would be, and that it was best he understood her at once. Yet to her inexperienced mind it seemed more easy to postpone the matter until she had time to collect her thoughts and reply to Kāra more gently and effectively. "Yes," said she, answering him. "Come to me in 2 days, please." To her surprise, he bowed gravely and at once left the room. But the relief she experienced made her glad that she had found this simple way to evade her present difficulties. In 2 days she would know better what to say to him. Kāra was astonished at his own forbearance. Where he might have threatened and compelled, he had merely implored, and he could not in the least understand the mood that had swayed his actions. But while in the girl's presence he seemed not to be himself, or even to know himself. If only Aneth would love him, how gladly would he shield her from the inheritance of his grandmother's malignant vengeance. Even if she could not love him, he was determined to win her for his wife, for the longing of his heart was at this time too great to be denied. In her tears and distress the girl had seemed more lovely than ever, and, as he drove slowly homeward, he dwelt upon her with an ecstasy of adoration that seemed entirely foreign to his cold and calculating nature. At this moment, perhaps, he really loved Aneth, but the Eastern lover is prone to sudden fits of intense passion that soon exhaust themselves, and the reaction is apt to restore them to their native apathy with surprising abruptness. When Kāra arrived home, he at once crossed the courtyard and entered the quarters devoted to women. Ever since Winston had sneered at his relations with Nephthys that morning, the thing had rankled in his mind, and now, fresh from Aneth's presence, he reproached himself for his folly in bringing the stupid Nile girl to Cairo. For, in spite of his efforts to amuse himself in her society, Nephthys had not only proved unable to destroy his love for Aneth, but her quiescent indifference, beautiful though she was, served rather to disgust him by its sharp contrast with the English girl's brightness and innocence. Never doubting that he would shortly install Aneth in Nephthys's place, he suddenly resolved to have done with the Egyptian girl, who had been so great a disappointment to him. There was a dark scowl upon Kāra's face as he pushed aside the draperies and entered the apartment of Nephthys. He found the girl seated upon her divan, with the dragoman comfortably established beside her. Both were smoking cigarettes, and Tadros was holding Nephthys with one arm loosely clasped around her waist. They did not notice the master's presence for a moment, But when they looked up, Kara was standing before them with folded arms. The frown had vanished, and his expression was one of positive content, for here was his excuse. "Tadros," said he in a soft voice, "be good enough to go into the courtyard. You may wait there for me." The dragoman stood up and flicked the ash from his cigarette. He was evidently much disturbed. "If you think, Kara," he began in a very loud, boisterous voice. "Go into the courtyard, please," interrupted the other quietly. Tadros hesitated and glanced at Nephthys. The girl was staring with frightened eyes into her master's face. Following her gaze, the dragoman gave a shudder. Kāra's countenance was as cold and inexpressive as that of a statue. Tadros had learned to fear that expression. Softly he tiptoed from the room, and the draperies fell behind him. Clinging to the curtains of the arch leading to the next room appeared old Tilga, who was trembling violently. Had the master been an Arab, her life was already forfeited. She was not sure what an Egyptian would do under the circumstances. Kāra beckoned her to approach. Then, pointing a finger at Nephthys, he said, "Remove those jewels and ornaments." As the old woman eagerly attempted to obey, Nephthys stood up and asked in a low, horrified voice, "What are you going to do?" Kāra did not reply. He watched Tilga's nervous fingers rapidly removing the diadem, earrings, brooches, and bracelets, which she cast in a heap upon a table. Nephthys submitted quietly until the hag seized her string of pearls. Then she shrank away and clutched at her throat to save her treasures, loving the pearls better than all else. Kāra grasped her wrists firmly and drew her hands down to her side, while Tilga unwound a triple row of priceless pearls from the girl's neck and added it to the heap upon the table. He continued to hold her fast until the housekeeper had stripped from her fingers the rings of diamond, ruby, and emerald. Then he let her go, and Nephthys moaned and covered her face with her hands. "Take off her robes," commanded Kāra sternly. Tilga rushed to do his bidding, and when Nephthys resisted, the hag struck her across the face with her open hand. She literally tore away the exquisite gown, as well as the silken hose and satin slippers, until the girl stood shorn of all her finery except the fleecy underclothing. "Leave her that," said Kāra. "And now where is her black cotton dress?" Tilga hurriedly fetched it from a closet in the robing chamber. She brought the head shawl and the coarse shoes also. Nephthys was sobbing now as miserably as a child that has been robbed of its toys. "I won't wear them. I won't have them. Take them away," she wailed as the old Fedah garments were produced. But the woman shook her angrily and slapped her again, covering her with the crude soiled gown and then pushing her back upon the divan while she placed the flat shoes upon the girl's bare feet. Tears were still standing in Nephthys's great eyes, but she submitted to the inevitable with a resumption of her old obedient manner. "Call Ebbek," said the master, and Tilga displayed such activity that she quickly returned, dragging the Arab after her. "You will take this woman back to Fedah, whence you brought her, and deliver her over to her mother again. There is a train at sundown, and you will be able to catch it if you are prompt. Drive to the station in a carriage." Ebbek bowed without betraying surprise at his master's unexpected command. Perhaps he had been observant and knew the reasons for the girl's dismissal. "Must old Sarah return your money?" he asked. "No. Tell her that she may keep it. Here is gold for your expenses. Feed Nephthys at the railway station, if you have time, and buy her some cigarettes. Now hasten." Ebbek took the girl's arm to lead her away. As she passed Kāra, she halted to say with despairing intensity, "I hate you. Some day I will kill you." Kāra laughed. He was in a pleased mood. "Goodbye, Nephthys," he rejoined complacently. "Tell Sarah I present you to her with my compliments." Then he left the room and found Tadros standing stiffly outside the door. "Follow me," he said, and the dragoman obeyed. He led the way to his own room and sat down facing the dragoman. Tadros remained standing. He held in his hand the stump of a half-burned cigarette, which he eyed critically and with an air of absorbing interest. Kāra, being amused, remained silent. After a time, the dragoman coughed to clear his throat. "You see, Kāra," he began, "I bought the girl first and paid good money for her when I was desperately poor, a fact that deserves some consideration. Yet you forced me to sell her." "Indeed?" "Yes, for an insignificant roll of papyrus. I don't complain, having accepted the bargain, But you mustn't blame me for all that has happened. By the beard of Osiris, is a man's heart to be bought and sold like a woman's body? It is absurd." He paused, shifting from one foot to the other. Then he lifted his eyes and was pained to find Kāra staring at him fixedly. "There should be no quarrel between us," he continued, striving to speak confidently. "I have been your jackal, and did your dirty work for a fair amount of pay. What then? To ruin me will cause your own downfall. You dare not do it. But I am honest with you, and a good servant. You need not fear me in the future, for I will promise you on my word to avoid your harem, the word of Tadros the dragoman." As he spoke, a shrill scream reached their ears. Tadros bounded to the window and through the lattice saw Ebbek pushing the unhappy Nephthys into a carriage. He turned a frowning face towards his master. "What are you doing to the girl?" he demanded fiercely. "Sending her back to Sarah." The dragoman uttered a curse and made for the door. "Come here," cried Kāra sternly. Tadros stopped, hesitated, and then returned. He realized that he could do nothing. "Very well," said he sullenly. "She will be safer in Fedah than in Cairo. But you have been cruel, Kāra. A man who is really a man would not treat a beast as you have treated Nephthys. To teach her the splendid luxury of a palace and then thrust her back into a mud hut on the forsaken Nile bank is a positive crime. I suppose you have also taken away her fine clothes and her pretty ornaments." "Yes." "Poor child! But there, one does not argue with a snake for fear of its venom. I am likewise in your power," said the dragoman gloomily. Kāra actually laughed at his rueful expression. "You were born a fool, my Tadros," said he, "and a fool you will die. Look you, there is no excuse in all your chatter to me of your own treachery, the crime that our customs declare merits death. You simply accuse me of harshness in sending away a faithless woman. Tell me, then, some plausible reason why I should not kill you." Tadros grew pale. "There are two reasons," he replied seriously. "One is that murdering me would cause you to get into trouble with the police. The other is that you have need of me." "Very good. The first argument does not count, because you could be killed secretly with no personal danger to me. And that, without doubt, is the manner in which I shall kill you some day. But your present safety, my Tadros, lies in your second reason. I still need your services, and will permit you to remain alive until I am quite sure to have no further use for you." The dragoman drew a long breath. "Let us forget it, Kāra," said he. "I admit that I have been somewhat indiscreet. But what then? All men are indiscreet at times, and you will cease to blame me when you discover how faithful I am to your interests." Kāra did not reply. The carriage had long since driven away. The dragoman again shifted his position uneasily. "May I go?" he asked. "Yes." And Tadros withdrew. His heart filled with fear and hatred, but the hatred remained long after the fear had subsided. End of chapter 15. Recording by Ian Stewart, Rosanna, Victoria, Australia.
Chapter 16 of The Last Egyptian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Last Egyptian by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 16. Kāra Threatens. Those 2 days were uneasy ones to Kāra. He felt no dread of Aneth's final answer, but the waiting for it was wearisome. Their arrangements might easily have been concluded at the last interview had he not been weak enough to defer to the girl's foolish desire to postpone the inevitable. Since he had come from Fedah, the world had been his plaything, and he found it in no way difficult to accomplish those things he determined upon. He had, therefore, acquired unbounded confidence in the powers of Ahtka-Ra's remarkable Stone of Fortune, which he believed to have a strong influence over all his undertakings. So the Egyptian merely sought to occupy his time to good advantage until he could bring his bride, willing or unwilling mattered little, home to his handsome villa. He sent Tadros to summon the most famous merchants of Cairo to wait upon him, and arranged to have the women's quarters redecorated in regal fashion. He selected many rich silks and embroideries for Aneth's use when she should need them, and secured an increased corps of Arab servants, well trained in their duties, to attend the slightest wish of their new mistress. He realized that the establishment must hereafter be conducted more upon the plan of a modern European household, and that the apartments of the harem must be transformed into parlors, reception halls, and drawing rooms. In marrying Aneth, he determined to abandon all Oriental customs and adopt the manners of the newer and broader civilization. He would exhibit his wife in society, and, through her, gain added distinction. His villa would become renowned for its fêtes and magnificent hospitality. Such a life appealed to his imagination, and a marriage with the English girl rendered it possible. Hatatcha had educated and trained Kāra for a purpose, but now her mission, and his oath to fulfill it, were alike disregarded. He had given the matter considerable thought recently, and decided that his love for Aneth Consinor cancelled all obligations to persecute her or her people further. Hatatcha was dead, and forgotten by the world, and her wrongs could never be righted by any vengeance that he might inflict upon her enemies. She could not appreciate the justice of retribution, since her spirit was far away in the netherworld with Anubis, and her body in the tombs of Fedah. He had at first been conscientious in his determination to accomplish his grandmother's will, but a girl's eyes had thwarted him, and Hatatcha had herself proved weak when love assailed her. Even as all his schemes were approaching fruition, and his grandmother's revenge was nearing accomplishment, the compelling power of his love arrested his hand, and induced him to cast aside everything that might interfere with his prospective happiness. On the afternoon of the second day, he dressed himself carefully, and ordered his chauffeur to be ready to drive him to the Savoy. But as he was about to leave his room, a note was brought to him from Aneth. He tore it open, and eagerly read the message. "Dear Prince Kāra, I am not going to risk another unpleasant interview, because I am anxious we should remain in the future, as in the past, good friends and comrades. But please do not again ask me to marry you, for such a thing is utterly impossible. While I am glad to enjoy your friendship, I can never return the love you profess to bear me, and without love a true woman will not marry. So I beg you will forget that such a thing has ever been discussed between us, and forbear to refer to it again. Your friend, Aneth Consinor." As he read the note, Kāra's face grew set and stern, and his dark eyes flashed ominously. He read it a second time with more care, trying to find some word of hope or compromise in the frankly written epistle, but there was none. He experienced a sensation of disappointment and chagrin, tinged with considerable astonishment. Strange as it may seem, he never for a moment anticipated such a positive refusal. But his nature was impetuous and capricious, and presently anger drove all other feelings from his heart, and the anger grew and expanded until it was hot and furious, and took full possession of him. Perhaps it was the blow to his self-esteem that was most effective in destroying the passion he had mistaken for love. Anyway, the love dissolved with startling rapidity, and in half an hour there was little tenderness remaining for the English girl who had repulsed him. He accepted her answer as conclusive, and began at once to revive his former plans of vengeance. One transport was liable to prove as sweet and exciting as another to him, and he began to revel in the consciousness that he was the supreme master of the fate of all the Consinors. Hatatcha was right, after all. These English were cold and faithless, and unworthy the consideration of one of his noble race. He had been incautious and weak for a time, but now he resolved to fulfill his oath to the dead woman to the very letter. He tore the offending paper into fragments, and left the room with a resumption of his old inscrutable demeanor. It was the look that Tadros had learned to fear. "Drive me to the Savoy," he said to his chauffeur. Lord Roane had reserved one small room on the first floor of the hotel as an office, and here he transacted such business matters as came under his jurisdiction. Kāra found him unoccupied, and Roane, who knew his visitor but slightly, greeted the man with cordial politeness. "Pray be seated, Prince," said he, offering a chair. "I am entirely at your service." The other bowed coldly. "I fear my mission may prove somewhat disagreeable to you, my lord," he began in quiet, even tones. Roan gave him a shrewd glance. "Ah, I hear that my son is largely indebted to you for losses in gambling," he returned, thinking that he understood Kara's errand. "So far it is merely a rumor that has reached me. But if you come to me to plead that case, I beg to assure you that I am in no way responsible for Consinor's debts of honor." The Egyptian shrugged his shoulders as a Frenchman might have done. "That is another matter, sir, which I do not care to discuss at this time," he answered. "My present business is to obtain your consent to marry your granddaughter." Roan was startled with amazement. "Aneth? You wish to marry Aneth?" he asked, as if he could not have heard aright. "Yes, my lord." So confident was the prince's tone that Lord Roan, although much unnerved by its suddenness, began involuntarily to consider the proposition. The fellow was handsome and dignified, and reputed to be as rich as Croesus. But the Englishman had a natural antipathy to foreigners, especially the dark-skinned ones. The idea of giving Aneth to an Egyptian was revolting. "Ahem! This is indeed a surprise, Prince," he said haltingly. "The child is hardly old enough yet to think of marriage." Kara did not reply to this observation. "Have you approached her with this proposal as yet?" inquired Roan, after a few moments' reflection. "I have, sir." "And what did she say?" "She refused to marry me, giving as her reason the fact that she does not love me," was the calm reply. Roan stared at him. "Then why the devil do you come to me?" he demanded angrily. "Because the girl must not be allowed to choose for herself," said Kara. "Must not, sir?" "Decidedly not, Lord Roan. Too much depends upon her refusal. At present your granddaughter stands disgraced in the eyes of all the world because of that dishonest father, who, as you remarked a moment ago, owes me £10,000. "Aneth disgraced!" cried Roan indignantly. "By no means, sir. Even your vile insinuations cannot injure that pure and innocent girl. But Consinor has gone away, and his daughter is now under my personal protection. I will see that she is accorded the respect and consideration to which she is entitled, despite her father's misdeeds." "Such an assertion, my lord, is under the circumstances ridiculous," replied Kara, with a composure equal to the other's irritation. "In the near future, when you are yourself disgraced and imprisoned, who will then be left to protect your granddaughter's good name?" Roan uttered a roar of exasperation. "You infernal scoundrel!" he exclaimed. "How dare you come here to browbeat and insult me? Leave my presence, sir." "I think you will be glad to hear more," remarked Kara, without changing his position. "Perhaps you are not aware that your robbery of the government through the contractor McFarland is fully known to me." Roan fell back in his chair, white and trembling. "It's a lie," he muttered. "It is not a lie," said the imperturbable Egyptian. "The proofs are all in my hands. I hold your receipt to McFarland for the stolen money." Roan glared at him, but had not a word to reply. He felt like a rat in a trap. From the most unexpected source this blow had fallen upon him when least expected, and already he bitterly regretted his lapse from honesty. "The Egyptian government, when it learns the facts," continued Kara, "will show you no mercy. Even Lord Cromer will insist upon your punishment, for he will resent any embezzlement in office that would bring the English colony here into disrepute. You must be aware of your danger without the necessity of my calling your attention to the fact, so that you have, absolutely, no hope of escape except through my clemency." "What do you mean?" asked the old nobleman hoarsely. "That at present the secret is in my sole possession. It need never be disclosed. Give me Aneth in marriage, and you will not only secure your safety, but I will see that you want for nothing in the future. I am wealthy enough to promise this." "The girl has refused you." "Never mind. You will force her to accept me." "No, by God, I will not!" cried Roan, springing to his feet. "Hell and all its imps shall not induce me to drag that innocent child to my own level. I am a felon because I am an ass, and an ass because I have no moral stamina. But even then my heart is not as black as yours, Prince Kara." The Egyptian listened unmoved. "The matter deserves more careful consideration," said he. "Sentiment is very pretty when it does not conflict with personal safety. An examination of your case reveals comfort and prosperity on the one hand, disgrace and prison on the other." "They weigh nothing against Aneth's happiness," returned the old man promptly. "Expose me as soon as you like, sir, for nothing will ever induce me to save myself from the fruits of my folly at the expense of that poor girl. And now, go!" Kara smiled with quiet scorn. "It is quite refreshing to witness your indignation," said he. "If it were equalled by your honesty, you would have no reason to fear me." "Nor do I fear you now," retorted Lord Roane defiantly. "Do your worst, you infamous nigger, for you cannot bribe me in any way to abet your shameful proposals." Kara reddened at the epithet, but did not reply until he had risen and started to move toward the door. Then he half turned, and said, "It will enable you to appreciate your danger better, Lord Roane, if I tell you that I am but the instrument of an Egyptian woman named Hatatcha, whose life and happiness you once carelessly ruined. She did not forget, and her vengeance against you and yours will be terrible, believe me, unless you engage me to defeat it, instead of accomplishing it. My personal interest induces me to bargain with you. What do you say, my lord? Shall we discuss this subject more fully, or do you wish me to go?" Roane was staring at him with affrighted eyes. 1,000 recollections flashed through his mind at the mention of Hatatcha's name, attended by 1,000 terrors as he remembered his treatment of her. So lost was he in fear and wonder that Kara had to speak again. "Shall I go, my lord?" "Yes," was the answer. It seemed to be wrenched from the old man's throbbing breast by a generosity that conquered his cowardice. Kara frowned. He was disappointed. But further argument was useless, and he went away, leaving Roane fairly stunned by the disclosures of the interview. End of chapter 16. Recording by Philip Gould.
Chapter 17 of The Last Egyptian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Last Egyptian by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 17. Kara went straight to Annette's apartments, insisting that he must see her. The girl was much distressed by this sudden visit, and, thinking the Egyptian wished merely to renew his protestations and appeals, tried hard to evade the ordeal of an interview. Mrs. Everingham was with her at the time, and in her perplexity Annette confided to her in a few brief words Kara's infatuation, and asked her advice how to act under such trying circumstances. Mrs. Everingham was a woman of strong character and shrewd judgment. She was tall and admirably formed, with undoubted claims to beauty and a carriage queenly and dignified. The wife of a prominent engineer, she had lived much in the Orient and was accustomed to its unconventionalities as well as to its most representative social life. Although so much older than Annette, the lady had manifested a fondness for the lonely girl from their first meeting, and had gladly taken her, as she expressed it, under her wing, as well as to her sympathetic heart, so that Annette had come to rely upon her friend in many ways, and now turned to her in this emergency. "I think it will be best for you to see him," advised Mrs. Everingham after a thoughtful consideration of the case. "If you evade the explanation he doubtless wishes to force upon you, he is the sort of man to annoy you persistently until you grant him an interview. Better have it over at once, and be positive with him, my dear, as well as gentle, so that you leave no hope alive to warrant his renewing his suit." "Won't you stay with me, Lola?" begged Annette. "That would hardly be fair to Prince Kara," smiled Mrs. Everingham, "for my presence would embarrass and humiliate him unnecessarily. No, I will withdraw into the next room, where I shall be within call, but invisible. Be brave, Annette dear. These disagreeable duties are often thrust upon women who, like yourself, have a faculty of unconsciously winning men's hearts, and are exacted as inevitable penalties. I am sorry for the poor prince, but he is not of our race and had no business to fall in love with an English girl." Then she kissed her protégé and retired to the adjoining room, taking pains to leave the door ajar. Annette sighed and called her Arab to admit Kara. When the Egyptian entered, His manner in no way indicated the despair of a rejected lover, or even the eagerness of one who hoped to successfully appeal his case. Instead, he bowed coldly, but with profound deference, and said, "You must pardon me, Miss Annette, for forcing this interview upon you, but it was necessary." "Forgive me also, Prince Kāra," faltered the girl. "I am sorry you came, for my answer was final. I can never—" He waved his hand with a gesture of insolent indifference that arrested her words. "You will not be called upon to repeat the dismissal conveyed in your letter," said he. "I may ask you to reverse your decision, but it will be a matter of business between us, in which inclination will have no part." "Sir," she replied, shrinking back from his stern look, I fear I do not understand you." "Be seated," he requested, "and I will explain." She obeyed silently, with a partial recovery of her self-control. Strange as the Egyptian's words proved, they were, after all, more bearable than his endearing protestations would have been, and in her ignorance she welcomed any topic but love. Kāra spoke with brutal frankness. "The scandal caused by your father's dishonesty is too recent for you to have yet escaped its contamination," he began. "Lord Consinor has left Cairo owing me money, a matter of some 10,000 pounds. That you may have no cause to doubt my word, please to examine this note of hand. It is witnessed by 2 respectable gentlemen residing in this city." He handed her the paper, and she took it mechanically, wondering what it meant. "According to our laws," he resumed, "I can bring an action to recover this money against any member of Consinor's family. I am assured this action would ruin Lord Roane completely." She was afraid of him now, but drew herself up proudly. "That will not matter in the least, sir," she replied. "Lord Roane will gladly meet any just obligation, even though it may leave him penniless to do so." "My lord does not express himself quite so honorably as that," replied Kāra with an open sneer. "But this note of hand is really unimportant. I merely mentioned it to emphasize the debt that you and your grandfather already owe me. Your father has cleverly escaped the results of his misdeeds by absconding. Unfortunately, Lord Roane is unable to do the same thing." "No one will blame Lord Roane for his son's faults," she protested, greatly distressed by the cruelty of Kāra's remarks. "That is not my meaning," he replied. "Roane's own misdeeds are so much more serious than those of his son that, when they are discovered, he cannot escape a prison cell." Annette gasped in horror. The accusation was at first beyond belief, but Kāra's tone was positive, and a sudden recollection of her grandfather's doubtful life flashed over her and made her dread to question further. It was not needful. The man continued calmly to enlighten her concerning McFarlane's crime and her grandfather's participation in it, while the girl sat with wide-open eyes and a look of despair upon her white face. Finally, Kāra produced a second paper. "This, Miss Annette," he said more gently, "is the receipt signed by Lord Roane for his share of the stolen money. It is proof positive against him, and you will, of course, recognize his signature. Besides, I can produce 2 witnesses to the crime, a crime for which the penalty is, as I have hinted, a long term of imprisonment as well as dishonor through all the ages to come. But this is only for discovery. There is no penalty exacted for an undiscovered crime. Personally, I do not wish to see Lord Roane disgraced and sent to prison, or your invalid mother impoverished, and you yourself left to the mercies of a reproachful world. So I have come here today to save you from all these consequences of Roane's folly, if you will let me." Annette tried to control her bewilderment. She wanted to think calmly. So vividly had Kāra described Lord Roane's offense that she saw it all before her as in a dream, and knew that the old man's feet were stumbling at the edge of a bottomless pit. But the last words of the Egyptian, if she had heard them aright, seemed to promise a chance of her awakening and exorcising the nightmare. "How can you save us?" she asked wearily. "By making you my wife," he answered. "It all rests with you, Miss Annette. I alone can protect Lord Roane from any possibility of discovery, and I will do so if you now promise to marry me. More than that, I will pay off all the mortgages on your grandfather's estates, so that he may live in comfort during the remainder of his life, honored and respected by all. And you shall have your father's note of hand for the 10,000 pounds as soon as I receive your promise, as an earnest of my good faith. And if I refuse," she suggested, trembling, "then you render me powerless to aid and plunge your aged grandfather into prison, disgraced and humiliated beyond any hope of redemption." "No, no, I cannot do that," she wailed miserably. He has been so good to me and loved me so fondly that I will not sacrifice him to secure my own happiness." "It is as I hoped," said Kāra, a note of triumph in his voice. "Do you promise, sacredly and on your honor, that you will marry me in return for my shielding your grandfather from the consequences of his crime?" "Yes," she answered, clasping her hands with a shudder. "And will you come to me any day and hour that I may appoint?" "Yes." "Annette, Annette, what have you said? What have you done?" cried Mrs. Everingham, running from her hiding place to clasp the terrified girl in her arms. "What have I done?" repeated Annette vacantly. "Why, Lola, I saved my dear grandfather from disgrace and ruin." "You shall not keep that promise," declared the woman, turning fiercely to confront Kāra. "It was wrung from you by threats, by blackmail, and this scoundrel is playing upon your generous and loving heart. You shall never keep so absurd a promise." "Yes," returned Annette bravely. "I have given my word, and I shall keep it." Kāra laid a paper upon the table. "There is your father's note, Miss Annette. You may destroy it." He hesitated an instant and then added the second paper. "And here is your grandfather's receipt for the stolen money. So fully do I trust to your good faith that I leave the incriminating evidence all in your own hands. Good afternoon, Miss Annette." With a bow, grave and courteous, he passed from the room, and Mrs. Everingham lifted the girl in her strong arms and carried her into the adjoining chamber to lay her tenderly upon her bed. The strain had been severe, and Annette had fainted. End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of The Last Egyptian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. The Last Egyptian by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 18. Finding a Way. Gerald Winston endured several miserable, uneasy days following that of Lord Consinor's public disgrace. He longed to call upon Aneth, but dared not intrude, and so compromised by sending her a daily gift of flowers. At last, however, he decided to see Mrs. Everingham and endeavor to ascertain Aneth's condition, and whether her father's fault was making her as sorrowful as he feared. He found Mrs. Everingham in her rooms in the Savoy, and was admitted at once. "I want to ask you about Miss Consinor," he said, after he had been warmly greeted, for they were good friends, and she was glad he had come. "Aneth is very unhappy," was the sober reply. "I can understand her humiliation, of course," he continued, with a sigh, "although I hoped she would be brave, and not take the unfortunate circumstance too much to heart." "She is young," answered Mrs. Everingham evasively, "and cannot view these things as composedly as we do. Moreover, you must remember that Lord Consinor's trouble touches her more deeply than anyone else." "Unless it is the Viscountess," he suggested. "Oh, the poor Viscountess knows nothing of it. She passes her time in an exclusive consideration of her own ailments, and will scarcely see her own daughter at all. Do you know, Gerald, I sometimes wonder how the child can be so sweet and womanly when her surroundings are so dreadful." "I know what you mean," he said. "Consinor has always borne a doubtful reputation at home, and in past years Roane's life has also been more or less disgraceful. But the old fellow seems to be conducting himself very properly since he came to Egypt, and it is possible he has reformed his ways." She did not reply at once, but sat musing until she asked, with startling abruptness, "Gerald, do you love Aneth?" He flushed and stammered in his endeavor to find words to reply. Since his interview with Kāra he had confessed to himself that he did love Aneth, but that another should discover his secret filled the big fellow with confusion. "Why do you ask?" he faltered, to gain time. "Because the girl needs true and loving friends more at this moment than in all her life to come," said she, earnestly. "I will be her true friend in any event," he returned. "But I must know more than that," persisted Mrs. Everingham. Tell me frankly, Gerald, do you love her?" "Yes." "Well enough to wish to make her your wife in spite of her family's shady history?" "Yes," he said again, looking at her inquiringly. "Then I shall confide to you a great secret, for it is right that you should be apprised of what is going on. And only you, with my assistance to be sure, can hope to defeat the cunning plot that threatens to separate Aneth from you for ever." Thereupon she related to him the details of the interview she had overheard between Kāra and the girl, and told of the promise Aneth had made to save her grandfather from disgrace by marrying the Egyptian. "But this is nonsense!" he exclaimed angrily. "The man is a fool to wish to force any woman to marry him, and a scoundrel to use such means to accomplish his purpose." "I know. I have discussed this matter with Aneth long and earnestly, but all in vain. She is determined to sacrifice herself to save Lord Roane from this disgrace, and Prince Kāra is inflexible. For some unknown reason he has determined to make this girl his wife, although he did not talk like a lover, and she told him frankly she could never love or even esteem him. Really, it seems incomprehensible." "I know his reason well enough," answered Winston moodily. "He is acting under the influence of the strongest and most evil human passion, revenge. If you will kindly listen, my friend, I will relate a bit of romance that should enable you to understand the Egyptian's purpose." He proceeded to recount the story of Hatatcha and Lord Roane, adding his grounds for believing that Kāra had from the first contemplated the ruin of the entire Consinor family. "This is horrible!" cried Mrs. Everingham indignantly. "If what you say is true, this native prince is himself a grandson of Roane, and therefore Aneth's cousin." "I have called attention to that fact, and he declares it is no bar to his marrying her. I imagine his real meaning is that the relationship is no bar to his prosecuting his nefarious plans. Does Lord Roane know of this proposed sacrifice of his granddaughter for his sake?" "No, and Aneth has made me promise to keep the secret from him. I cannot see that he would be able to assist us in any way if he knew all that we know." "Perhaps not. Is the story true? Has Roane actually embezzled this money?" "I do not know." "It seems to me," said the young man, thoughtfully, "that our first action should be to discover the truth of Kāra's assertion. He may have trumped up the charge to work upon Aneth's feelings, and lead her to consent to marry him against her will." "That is true," she said. "How can we investigate the matter?" "Very easily. I will go to morrow to the Rosetta barrage and examine the embankment. Afterward I can look up the records and discover what sort of contract this man McFarland had, and how much money he collected for its execution. That will give us the truth of the matter, and I can accomplish it all in 2 days' time." "Then go, but make haste, for every day is precious. We do not know when the prince may call upon Aneth to fulfill her promise." They discussed the situation a while longer, and then Winston withdrew to prepare for taking the early morning train. The second evening after, he again called upon Mrs. Everingham. "Well?" she inquired eagerly. "What did you discover?" "It is all true," he answered despondently. "The swindle has been very cleverly consummated, and in just the way Kāra explained it to Aneth. There is no doubt of Lord Roane's guilt, neither can we doubt that Kāra has both the power and the will to expose and imprison him if it suits his purpose to do so." "Then," said Mrs. Everingham, firmly, "we must find another way to save Aneth. The poor child is heartbroken, and moans every moment that she is left alone with her misery. Lord Roane tries earnestly to comfort her, for I am sure he loves her as well as one of his character is capable of loving. But he imagines she grieves over her father, and does not suspect the truth." "Is she still resolved upon keeping her promise?" he inquired. "Yes, and that in spite of all I can say to move her. The girl has a gentle and loving nature, but underneath it is a will of iron and a stubbornness such as the early martyrs must have possessed. She holds her own happiness as nothing when compared with her grandfather's safety." "Then what can we do?" he asked, pacing the floor nervously. "We must resort to a cunning equal to Kāra's in order to induce Aneth to break her foolish promise," responded Mrs. Everingham promptly. "I fear I do not quite understand," he said, stopping before her to read her countenance for the clue. "I think, nay, Gerald, I am certain, the girl loves you, for I have questioned her skilfully during your absence and led her to speak of you, watching her tell-tale eyes as she did so. In my opinion, it is this secret love for another that makes her sacrifice so grievous, and will end in breaking her heart." He blushed like a girl at hearing this, but was evidently reassured and delighted. "Yet I do not understand even now, Mrs. Everingham," he said. "It is not so much that you are as stupid as that you are a man," she answered, smiling. "You must become the instrument to save Aneth from herself. In a few moments I shall take you to see her. Her rooms are just across the hall, and doubtless she is at this moment alone, Lord Roane having left the hotel an hour ago. This evening I will give you countenance, but thereafter you must play your own game, and do your utmost to draw from Aneth a confession that she loves you. When you have done that, our case is won." "Why so?" "Can't you see, Gerald? No right-minded girl would ruin the life of the man she loves to save her grandfather from the consequences of his own errors. If she is in the mood to sacrifice, we will let her sacrifice Lord Roane instead of herself or you." "Oh," he said blankly, "I can't do that, you know, Mrs. Everingham." "Why not?" "It would not be honest or fair, and it would be selfish in me and unmanly." "But I am not thinking of you at all, sir, except as the instrument. I am thinking of Aneth and her life's happiness. Are you willing, on your part, to sacrifice her to such a man as Kāra, that he might crush her to gratify his revenge?" "No, but—" "Will you permit her in her blindness and folly to break her own heart and ruin her own life, when you know that you can save her?" "No." "The struggle is between you and Kāra. Lord Roane is a felon, and to save him from the penalty due his acts will be to merely postpone the day when another of his criminal misdeeds will be discovered. There is little possible redemption for a man who has attained his sinful years, but if the possibility did exist, the price would be too high. Opposed to the desirability of shielding this reprobate nobleman and giving Kāra his way, which simply means Aneth's ruin, we must consider your mutual love and the prospect of a long life of happiness for you both. Do you dare to hesitate, Gerald Winston?" "I will do exactly as you say, Mrs. Everingham," he replied impetuously. "I can't let her go to this fiend, to the terrible fate that awaits her. Tell me what to do, and I will obey." "Your first duty will be to come with me to her room. And drop that long face, sir. Be cheery and light-hearted, and woo Aneth as tenderly as if you were wholly ignorant of the dreadful position she is in. Arrange to call again to-morrow, and in the future do not leave her alone for a single evening, and haunt her at all hours of the day. Remember that time is precious, and the situation demands all your skill and diplomacy. It cannot be a long siege. You must determine to capture her by attack." "I'll try," he said nervously. And so he met Aneth again, for the first time since her trouble had come upon her, and he performed his part so creditably that Mrs. Everingham had but little fault to find with her coadjutor. The sight of the girl's swollen eyelids and her sad and resigned expression of countenance so aroused his loving pity and indignation at the cruel plot that had enmeshed her, that he could scarcely restrain the impulse to declare at once his love and entreat her to give him an immediate right to protect her. Perhaps Aneth read something of his love for her in his eager face, for she joined with Mrs. Everingham in sustaining the flow of small talk that was likely to prove her best safeguard, and in this way was led to forget for the moment her cares and fears. She hesitated a moment when Gerald proposed to bring her a new book next afternoon, but finally consented. Therefore he left her feeling more buoyant and hopeful than he had thought could be possible a few short hours before. From that evening his former shyness disappeared, and he pushed his suit with as much ardor as he dared, utterly ignoring Aneth's evident desire to restrain him from speaking too plainly. But sometimes she, too, forgot her impending fate, and gave way to the delight of these happy moments. Already she knew that Gerald loved her, for her woman's instinct was alert, and at night she lay upon her bed and wailed miserably because the gates of paradise had suddenly opened before her, and her willing feet were so bound that she might not enter. During these days Lord Roane devoted much of his time to his grandchild, treating her with almost reverential tenderness, and striving in every possible way to cheer her spirits. The old man realized that his probation might be short. At any moment Kāra was liable to fulfill his threat and expose him to the authorities, and involuntarily he caught himself listening at all times for the footfall of the official coming to arrest him. He even wondered why he had escaped so long, knowing nothing of the manner in which Aneth had saved him. And the girl, noting his loving care for her and marking the trouble that often clouded his handsome face, was encouraged in her resolve to carry out her compact with Kāra rather than see her aged grandfather thrust into prison, humiliated and disgraced. Between her awakening love for Gerald Winston and her desire to save the family honor, the girl was indeed in pitiable straits. Yet never for a moment did she hesitate as to which way the path of duty led. She felt that every day she remained unmolested by the Egyptian was a precious boon to be grateful for. Yet always she dreaded Kāra's summons. However, he was in no hurry, realizing the bitterness to her of these days of waiting, and enjoying the prolongation of her sufferings. All the love that Kāra had formerly borne the girl seemed to have dissolved as if by magic, and in its place had grown up schemes for so horrible a vengeance that he often wondered whether Hatatcha herself might not have hesitated to accomplish it. But Kāra did not hesitate. The very diablerie of the thing fascinated and delighted him, and he anticipated the event with eager joy. Tadros spent much of his time at the hotel in charge of Kāra's elaborate system of espionage. His functions as dragoman gained for him special privileges, and the hall porter allowed him free access to the lobby, yet he was only able to enter the upper halls when he could plead some definite errand. This excuse was provided by a guest of the hotel, an agreeable Frenchman who was in Kāra's employ and maintained a surveillance over the interior of the establishment, while a half-dozen Arabs and Copts watched carefully the exterior. Thus Tadros was enabled to keep in close touch with the movements of Lord Roane and Aneth, as well as to spy upon those who might visit them, and his orders were to report promptly to Kāra any suspicious circumstances which might indicate that his victims were planning their escape. But from the dragoman's reports all seemed well, and his prospective prey apparently made no effort to evade their fate. Kāra depended much upon Aneth's delicate sense of honor and her strength of character, and read her so truly that there was little chance of her disappointing him. Roane, however, caused him a little uneasiness, and the Egyptian's spies shadowed him wherever he went. But Kāra misjudged the old gentleman if he supposed that Roane would tamely submit to Aneth's sacrifice had he known her secret. The girl understood him better, and although she did not know of his indignant rejection of Kāra's offer to shield him at the expense of his granddaughter's happiness, Aneth knew that if Roane learned the truth he would at once give himself up to justice in order to save her, and here was a danger the clever Egyptian had not even suspected. In many of his dealings Roane was doubtless an unprincipled knave, but certain points of character were so impressed upon his nature, through inheritance from generations of more noble consignors, that in matters of chivalry his honor could not be successfully challenged. The dragoman said nothing to Kāra about Winston's frequent visits to Aneth. During his hours of watching, Tadros involved in reflection, and these musings encouraged a growing resentment toward his master that destroyed much of his value as a confidential servant. Aside from the resentment, Tadros was afraid of Kāra, and also uneasy as to his financial condition. The prince, who was accustomed to scatter money with a liberal hand, had of late refrained from exhibiting a single piastre. Tadros wondered and grew suspicious. One evening, as he reported to Kāra, he said, "The tradesmen are clamoring for their money. They say you are not paying them as promptly as you did heretofore." Kāra looked up with surprise. "Is not my credit good?" he inquired. "For the present, yes," replied the dragoman, "but it will not remain good unless you begin to pay for all the magnificence you are putting into this villa." "I see," said Kāra, nodding thoughtfully. "They are fools, my Tadros, but they might become troublesome. Keep them satisfied with promises for a time longer. That should not be a difficult task." Tadros looked at him distrustfully. "Tell me, my prince, have you spent all your treasure?" he asked. The Egyptian smiled. "If I should live 1,000 years, my Tadros," he returned, "I could not spend the half of it." "Then why do you not pay these merchants?" "Because I have at this time no more money in the bank, and it is not convenient for me to leave Cairo just now to secure a further supply." "Oh, I see," remarked the dragoman, heaving a sigh of relief. "You must make another trip to Fedah." Kāra gave him one of those intent, thoughtful looks that always made Tadros uneasy, but when he spoke his voice sounded soft and pleasant. "What causes you to think my treasure is at Fedah, my good friend?" he asked. The tone reassured the dragoman. "It stands to reason, my prince, that it is there," he answered with frank indifference. "Do I not well remember first seeing the papyri in your house, and afterward carrying away from there the heavy traveling case that was filled with the precious gems?" "Ah, was it?" "Of course, Kāra. How else could you give so many ancient gems to the Van der Veens to recut, or turn so many more into money by selling them to Andalaft the jeweler?" "You have been observant, my Tadros." "It is natural. I am no fool; but if, as you say, there is more treasure at Fedah, I will undertake to keep the rascally tradesman quiet until you can make another deposit in the bank." Kāra was still reading the countenance of his dragoman. "It is quite evident that you are no fool, my Tadros," he said softly. "Yet I had not imagined you capable of so much shrewdness and wisdom. Look you, Fedah consists of a rock and a few stone houses cemented with Nile mud. It is familiar to you, being your birthplace as well as my own. Now, where do you suppose, within the limits of that simple village, a treasure could have been discovered?" "It has puzzled me," acknowledged Tadros, "but I suppose you do not wish me to know the exact location. Nevertheless, it is evident that the treasure is a very ancient one, and therefore it must have been hidden by your forefathers in the mountain itself, or perhaps on the desert that adjoins the village." "A long buried and forgotten temple, eh, Tadros?" "Oh, no, a tomb, of course. They did not keep pearls and rubies in the temples; only in tombs could such trinkets be found. That is why I believe your statement that you are the last descendant of the great kings of Egypt, for this tomb was not discovered by accident, I know. The secret of its existence must have been handed down through the generations. Hatatcha knew of it and told you of it before she died, so it is your personal property, and its possession proves your noble blood. I am glad the treasure is ample, for at the rate you are squandering money it would otherwise soon be exhausted." "Very wisely argued, indeed," said Kāra. "I wonder how much of my inheritance has already found its way into your own pockets?" "Not too much, you may be sure," answered the dragoman gravely. "I am very honest, and take only my rightful perquisites. It is better that these trifles should go to me than to strangers, for I am your own kinsman, and almost as pure an Egyptian as yourself." "True. I do not complain, my Tadros; but in acquiring my money you should take care not to acquire too much knowledge of my affairs with it, for such knowledge is liable to prove extremely dangerous. Consider the pearls of wisdom that have even now dropped from your lips. Must they not be repaid? And already I am greatly in your debt." "You are talking riddles," growled the dragoman uneasily. "Tell me what you mean in plain words." "Do you remember the day that Nephthys broke her water jar?" "Yes." "You struck me, your prince, and knocked me down." "Well, you choked me afterward. That should even the score." "Not quite. I choked you for spying upon me. That was another offense. The blow has not yet been accounted for." Tadros frowned. "I do not bear grudges myself," he muttered. "There are a few other matters scored against your account," continued Kāra. "Still, so long as you serve me faithfully, and I have need of you, I shall not exact a reckoning. But they stand on record, my Tadros, and some day the account must be balanced. Do not forget that. For these reasons, and remembering that you have declared yourself no fool, I am certain that you will admit you were wrong about the location of my treasure. When you think it over, you will conclude that it lies in Luxor or Abydos, or perhaps is a myth altogether and never has existed. And when you chatter to others, no mention of a hidden tomb or temple will be permitted to pass your lips. I am quite sure you will be circumspect, and I trust you to keep to yourself the secret of my affairs. If I thought you would betray me, I would kill you now instead of waiting. But you will not do that. You are too fond of living and of the money you are saving to hazard losing both." Tadros returned to his duties in a very thoughtful mood. In playing upon his fears, Kāra had overreached himself and made the dragoman so much afraid that he believed his life hung by a thread. Therefore he sought most earnestly for a way of escape from the thrall of his terrible countrymen. The following morning Gerald Winston, on leaving Mrs. Everingham after a conference concerning their plans, met Tadros face to face in the corridor of the hotel. He recognized the man at once as Kāra's dragoman and confidential servant. Moreover, he suspected that the fellow had just come from the Consinor apartments, so he had no hesitation in accosting him. "May I speak with you a moment in private?" he asked. "Most certainly, sir." Winston led the way into Mrs. Everingham's drawing room, where the lady greeted his return with surprise, but a quick appreciation of the importance of securing an interview with Kāra's confidant. "You are Prince Kāra's dragoman, I believe?" began the Englishman. "Yes, Winston Bey." "And devoted to him personally, of course?" "To an extent, naturally," returned Tadros, hesitating what to say. "You see, he pays me liberally." Winston and Mrs. Everingham exchanged glances. Then the lady took up the conversation. "Prince Kāra," she said in a stern tone, "is a scoundrel, being even now engaged in perfecting one of the most diabolical plots the mind of man has ever conceived." Tadros did not reply. It was not his business to deny the charge. "Our desire and intention to defeat this plot," she continued, "lead us to speak with you frankly. We must save Miss Consinor from an ignoble alliance with your master." Tadros listened carefully. "To accomplish our purpose, we are willing to expend a great deal of money, enough to make some faithful ally comfortable for the remainder of his life." A pause followed this significant statement. Tadros felt the effect of their scrutinizing glances, and cleared his throat while he looked swiftly around to make sure they could not be overheard. Then, reassured, he answered with his native bluntness of speech. "I am willing to earn this money," said he, "if you will show me how to do it with safety. Kāra is a fiend. He would not hesitate to kill all three of us if he had reason to suspect we were plotting against him." "I will give you £1,000," said Winston, "if you will tell us what you know of Kāra's plan. I will give you £2,000 additional if we succeed in saving Miss Consinor." Tadros was pleased. He had intended to break with Kāra anyway. To be well paid for doing this was a stroke of good fortune. "I accept your offer," he replied, "but I must inform you that there is no time to be lost. I have just taken a message to Miss Consinor, telling her to be ready to go to Kāra at 9 o'clock this evening." "This evening!" exclaimed Winston, alarmed. "And what was her reply?" "She assured me that she would keep her compact with the prince and be ready to accompany me at the hour named. I am to call for her and take her in a closed carriage to Kāra's villa." "And then?" asked Mrs. Everingham eagerly. "Then there is to be a mock ceremony of marriage, which is intended to entrap the young lady so that she will think everything is regular and will make no disturbance," answered Tadros calmly. "A Copt named Michael, who is one of Kāra's servants, is to be dressed as a priest, and perform the Coptic marriage service, which is a Christian function not unlike your own. But the man is not a priest, and the marriage will be illegal. The intention is to destroy the young lady's good name, after which Kāra will drive her away. Then he intends to deliver her grandfather, Lord Roane, over to justice." "What a dreadful crime!" exclaimed Mrs. Everingham indignantly. "And Aneth is sacrificing herself because she believes the act will save her grandfather." "That is Kāra's promise," returned the dragoman, "but he has no intention of keeping it. Did he not give her a forged copy of Roane's receipt? For some reason my prince aims at the ruin of the entire Consinor family. The young lady's father he has already disgraced and driven from Cairo." "I understand his motive," said Winston, "and believe you are right in claiming that Kāra will not spare Lord Roane once Aneth is in his power. The danger is terrible and imminent, for nothing will move Aneth to abandon her purpose. She imagines she is saving Roane, and has exacted from us a promise not to tell the old gentleman of her sacrifice. So our hands are tied." "It seems to me," declared Mrs. Everingham, after a moment's thought, "that we must use the self same weapons in fighting Kāra that he is employing. With the dragoman's assistance it ought to be easy to save Aneth, even against her will." "In what way?" inquired Gerald earnestly. She did not reply at once. Instead, she studied the dragoman's countenance with steadfast eyes. "What is your name?" she asked. "Tadros, madam." "Will you follow our instructions faithfully, and not betray us to Prince Kāra?" "Yes. I hate Kāra. He will kill me for deserting him if he gets the chance, but then he intends to kill me anyway as soon as he can spare my services. If your plan includes the murder of Prince Kāra, I shall be very glad." "It does not, but we will protect you from any harm, rest assured. Your task is simple. When you call for Miss Consinor tonight, you will drive her, not to the prince's villa, but to the embankment, where you will place her on board Winston Bey's dahabeah. It will lie opposite Roda on the west bank. Cross the Gezireh bridge and drive as rapidly as possible to the boat, where we shall be waiting to receive you." "My dahabeah!" cried Winston, astonished. "To be sure. You will have everything in readiness for a voyage up the Nile, with a prisoner aboard." "A prisoner?" "Yes, Aneth. She will of course refuse to go willingly, having given Kāra her word. I will accompany the party as her keeper, and we must find some way to induce Lord Roane to join us also. Once afloat on the mysterious river, Kāra will have no means of knowing what has become of his victims, and before we return, my friend, we shall have perfected such arrangements as will render the prince's intention to marry our Aneth impossible. That is why I desire Lord Roane to join the party. He will also be safe from Kāra for a time." "I understand you now," said Winston, "and while I do not see quite to the end of the adventure, the plan will at least give us some time to formulate our future action and enable us to thwart Kāra's immediate schemes." "That is my idea," she returned. "Something must be done at once, and by abducting Aneth we gain not only time, but save her temporarily from the consequences of her own folly." Then she turned to Tadros. "What do you think of my plan?" she asked. "It is excellent," said he, "except for one thing. There are several spies about this hotel, who would at once follow us and inform Kāra that we had boarded the dahabeah, but I think I can find a way to throw them off the scent. They are under my orders, and I will send them to other stations before 9 o'clock. Aside from this, then, do I understand that my only duty is to deliver the young lady on board the dahabeah?" "That is all we ask." "I will show 3 red lights," said Winston, "so that you cannot mistake the exact location of the boat." "I know the boat," replied the dragoman. "Abdallah, your engineer, is a friend of mine." "You will not fail us?" asked Mrs. Everingham, anxiously. "All depends on you, Tadros." "I know, and I will not fail you," he said. "I believe you will earn the £3,000," remarked Winston significantly. "As for that, sir," replied the dragoman with dignity, "I hope you will give me credit for a little humanity as well as cupidity. Being an Egyptian, I love money. Being a man, I am eager to assist a woman in distress. But above all else, I shall have pleasure in defying Kāra, who hates me as heartily as I hate him. Thus 3 passions vouch for my fidelity: love, pity, and hatred. Can you doubt my devotion to the cause?" After this he went away, leaving his fellow conspirators to plan the details of the evening's adventure. Chapter 19.
Chapter number 19 of The Last Egyptian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Tomlinson. Chapter 19. The Abduction. Mrs. Everingham passed the afternoon in Aneth's company. The girl was visibly nervous and excited, but made pitiful attempts to conceal her weakness. In no way did she allude to Kāra or to the fact that the hour had arrived when she was to consummate the sacrifice of her own happiness to maintain her grandfather's integrity and the honour of her family's name. Her friend ventured 1 or 2 remarks about the folly of her promise and the absurdity of keeping it. But these so distressed Aneth and had so little visible influence upon her decision that Mrs. Everingham abandoned the topic and turned the conversation into more cheerful channels. When she mentioned Gerald Winston, she noticed that Aneth's cheeks flamed scarlet and then turned deathly white. So here was another subject to be avoided, if she did not wish to make the girl's position unbearable. Indeed, those last days of association with Gerald had taught Aneth the full extent of her martyrdom, and now she began to realize that she was losing all that might have rendered her life's happiness complete, had it not been for the advent of Kara and his terrible threat to destroy the family honor and send her loving grandfather to prison. Early in the evening, Mrs. Everingham kissed her friend and returned to her own room across the corridor, there to complete her simple preparations for the proposed voyage. Meantime, Winston had been busy with Lord Rowan. The young man was fortunately a prime favourite with Aneth's grandsire, and he listened attentively to Gerald's explanation of a plot to rescue his darling grandchild from the slough of despondency into which she had fallen. Mrs. Everingham is confident a Nile voyage would do much to cheer her up and keep her from dwelling upon her troubles, he suggested. What do you think of the idea, sir? Capital, said Rowan, if Aneth can be induced to consent. I asked her to run over to Helwan the other day for a few weeks' change of scene, but she declared she would not listen to such a proposal. That is our difficulty, acknowledged Winston, speaking in a confidential tone. She has told Mrs. Everingham she would not leave Cairo, but we think her decision is based upon the fear that you would be unable to accompany her. So we have decided to engage in a little conspiracy. For the morbid condition into which she has fallen has made us all anxious. Is there any reason, my lord, why you should not leave Cairo for a month or so? None whatever, if my going will benefit Aneth in any way. Very good. Now here is our plan. I have fitted my private dahabeeyah for a cruise. Mrs. Everingham will go along to chaperone your granddaughter, and you will join us to complete her happiness and keep her contented. Only one thing stands in our way, the young lady's refusal to embark. That barrier will be surmounted by Mrs. Everingham, who is a woman of experience and who loves Aneth as well as if she were her own daughter. So this evening you and I will get aboard quietly without declaring our intentions to anyone, and rely upon Mrs. Everingham's promise to join us with Aneth at 9 o'clock. Do not ask me, sir, how she will succeed in overcoming your granddaughter's scruples against leaving Cairo. We will trust the woman's wit. When the party is embarked, we will go up the Nile to find roses for your grandchild's pale cheeks and have a jolly good time as well. Rowan accepted the programme with enthusiasm. He himself was in a dreadfully nervous state, expecting hourly to be accused of a crime, the proof of which would separate him forever from Aneth. To get away from Cairo just now, without Kara's knowing where he had gone, would be to gain a few weeks' respite. Eagerly he availed himself of the opportunity. Winston knew there was no danger of the old man's betraying their plans, but he could not divine what Kara's next move might be, and resolved to take no chances. So he clung fast to Rowan until he had put him and his light luggage aboard the dahabeeyah, whereupon he sent a message to appraise Mrs. Everingham of his success. So far all had gone well, but Mrs. Everingham's anxiety grew as the hour of 9 approached. Lord Rowan had sent word to Aneth that he would be out for dinner and might not return to the hotel until late that night. So the girl, glad of this fortunate chance, had her dinner served in her own room, and the Arab servant, being intercepted by Mrs. Everingham, declared that she ate little and wept continually, as if overcome by some hopeless sorrow. All depended now upon the faithfulness of Tadros, the dragoman, and Mrs. Everingham, finding nothing more for her woman's ingenuity to devise, entered a carriage at 8:30 o'clock and was driven quietly to the embankment. Within sight of the 3 red lights Winston had displayed, she halted her vehicle to await the arrival of the dragoman. Tadros, meantime, being fully instructed by Kara as to the conduct of his mission, drove in the Egyptian's private carriage to the hotel. The coachman had been instructed to obey the dragoman's orders implicitly, so he suspected nothing when Tadros, having alighted at the Savoy, commanded him to drive to the citadel and remain in the shadow of the mosque until midnight. The dragoman then hired another carriage that was driven by a sleepy and stupid-looking Arab, after which he immediately entered the hotel and went directly to Aneth's room. She opened the door in person, having dismissed all her attendants. "It is 9 o'clock, miss," announced Tadros as he entered. The girl clasped her hands with a gesture and look of terror. "Where is Prince Kara?" she asked vaguely. "At his villa, awaiting with the bridal party your arrival. You must understand that the wedding is to be very quietly conducted, yet strictly in accordance with the requirements of the Christian faith. My master desires me to say that every consideration and courtesy shall be shown you, his highest ambition in the future being to promote your happiness." She shuddered. "Is that all he said?" "Except that his promises to you shall be faithfully kept, and Lord Roan's comfort and safety carefully provided for." "Let us go," she said hastily. "I am ready." "Any luggage, miss?" he asked. She pointed to a small travelling case that stood beside her, and Tadros stooped and picked it up. With a frightened glance around her, she placed a note directed to Lord Roan upon the table and then hurriedly left the room, leaving the door unlocked. The dragoman escorted her to the side entrance, reserved for ladies, and they were fortunate in finding it almost deserted at that moment. Aneth entered the carriage quickly, as if fearful of being interrupted in her escape, and Tadros closed the door and took his seat beside the driver. "To the Opera House," he said, for the benefit of the few loungers who stood upon the pavement. After driving a couple of blocks, he made the Arab driver stop in front of a tobacco shop and sent him in to purchase some cigarettes. The moment the fellow disappeared, Tadros started the horses and applied the whip, and the carriage had whirled swiftly around the corner before the wandering Arab returned to the street to find his equipage and his passengers missing. Aneth, as soon as she had leaned back against the cushions, had fallen into a sort of stupor. Her weary brain refused to think or to speculate upon the doubtful fate to which she was rushing. She felt the carriage bumping over the crossings and saw vaguely the lights flash by, but she noted neither the direction in which they were proceeding nor the length of their journey. Across the Nile bridge the horses abated their speed, but then through the darker lanes of the west embankment they dashed along at a wild pace that might have frightened the girl had she been capable of realizing the actual conditions. Suddenly, with a jolt that almost threw her into the opposite seat, the carriage halted. She looked out of the window and saw 3 dim red lights burning, and beyond these the glint of a stray moonbeam upon the river. When Tadros came to assist her in alighting, she saw Mrs. Everingham standing behind him. "Where am I?" asked the girl wildly. "Hush, dear," said her friend, taking her in her arms to kiss her tenderly. "Am I not welcome at your wedding?" "But why are we here?" asked Aneth pleadingly. "Why are we at the river, and where is Prince Kara?" "Come and let me surprise you," answered Mrs. Everingham soothingly, leading the young girl, who was still half dazed and thoroughly mystified, aboard the Dar Habija and into the brightly lighted little cabin. There sat Lord Roan and Gerald Winston. Aneth stared, and then looking wildly around, she gave a plaintive cry and threw herself into her grandfather's arms. "I don't understand," she wailed, sobbing hysterically. "What does it all mean? Why are you here, and where is Prince Kara?" Roan was puzzled by her speech as well as distressed by her agitation. "Prince Kara," he repeated. "Confound it, Aneth, you don't want that rascally nigger, do you?" "No, no," she replied, "but he wants me, and I have promised. I must go to him. Why am I here? "What have you done?" By this time the dragoman had tied his horses to a palm and come aboard, just as Hassan drew in the gangplank and Abdallah started the wheezy engine. Tadros stood in the cabin doorway and listened intently to Aneth's protests. "See here, miss," he exclaimed with assumed sternness, "you are in my charge, for I am Prince Kāra's dragoman, and you have promised to obey me. Is it not so?" She turned to look at him. "Are you obeying Prince Kāra's orders?" she demanded. "To be sure. He wished to surprise you. He says he merely intended to test your honesty, being interested in knowing whether an English girl would keep her promises. But he does not desire to make you unhappy. He is a prince and generous, therefore he releases you from your compact, and you are free from this time forth to do exactly as you please." She was white and trembling now. "But my grandfather," she began eagerly. Tadros cut her short. "He also is safe, in proof of which you see him at your side. You need have no fears in the future that—" He stopped abruptly, for the overwrought nerves of the girl could not withstand this sudden revulsion of fate. Gerald caught her swaying form and carried her to her berth, where Mrs. Everingham tended her lovingly and applied restoratives to relieve her faintness. As for Lord Roane, he swore loudly and glared upon the dragoman. "What cursed nonsense is this?" he cried. Tadros smiled, and Gerald came up and seized the dragoman by both hands, pressing them warmly. "Thank you, my man," said he. "You are a loyal ally, and I shall not forget how you have lied to save us from an embarrassing position." Then he turned to Lord Roane. "If there is anything your lordship does not understand," he said, "I will gladly endeavour to explain it. Prince Kāra has been playing a deep game with you and Aneth as pawns, but I think we have him checkmated at last." The old nobleman did not reply at once. Any questioning on his part would necessarily be a very delicate matter. He turned his eyes thoughtfully towards the shore, where the lights of Cairo were slowly disappearing from their view. End of chapter 19. Recording by Peter Tomlinson, London.
Chapter 20 of The Last Egyptian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Last Egyptian by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 20. The Sheikh agrees. Kāra congratulated himself. For one whose early life had been passed in a hovel, he had been very successful in directing the destinies of the great. All his grandmother's vengeful plans, supplemented by his own clever arrangement of details, had matured in a remarkably satisfactory manner, and this evening he was destined to complete the ruin of Lord Roane's family. In addition to compromising Aneth beyond all hope by a false marriage, he would tomorrow have my lord cast into prison on a charge of embezzlement. The proof which he had pretended to place in the girl's keeping, and which she had without doubt promptly destroyed, was merely a forgery of the receipt to MacFarland. The original was still safe in his custody. The ruse had been a clever one. His judgment of the girl's nature was marvellously accurate. Having destroyed the paper to ensure her grandfather's safety, Aneth was effectually prevented from breaking her contract with Kāra. There was no way for her to recede. He had paid the price, and she was left with no excuse for not fulfilling her part of the agreement. When Kāra entered his courtyard, he found it ablaze with lights. The women's apartments, now completely refitted, were truly magnificent. A dozen servants, arrayed in splendid costumes, stood motionless at their posts, awaiting the arrival of their new mistress. Michael, a rascally Copt whom Kāra had recently attached to his household, was clad in priestly robes, and paced up and down the court with an assumed dignity that elicited sly smiles from his fellow servants. Only the prince's own people were present, for Kāra wished to be in a position to deny even the farce of a ceremony, should Aneth attempt in the future to use it as an excuse for her downfall. But it pleased him to lull her suspicions in this way in the beginning, and so render her an easy victim. It also gave an added flavour to his revenge. Tadros had been carefully instructed, and would have no difficulty in fulfilling his mission. He ought to reach the villa on his return by 9:30, allowing for natural delays. Kāra trusted Tadros because the dragoman was completely in his power, but, with his usual caution, he had sent a spy to watch his messenger and report any irregularity in his conduct. Tadros did not know of this spy, otherwise he might have felt less confidence in himself. 9:30 arrived, and no sound of carriage wheels broke the stillness. The servants stood motionless in their places, and Kāra paced the courtyard in deep reflection while engaged in drawing on his white kid gloves. The false priest stood under the bower of roses where the ceremony was to take place, trying to find the service in the Coptic Bible he had borrowed. 9:45. 10 o'clock. The dark-eyed servants noticed that their master grew uneasy and cast anxious glances towards the entrance. It was 20 minutes later, when the nerves of the most unconcerned were beginning to get on edge, that the patter of horses' feet and the rapid whir of wheels broke the silence. A carriage dashed up to the villa and halted. Kāra hurried forward expectantly, but paused abruptly when he met the spy who had been sent to watch Tadros. "Where is the dragoman?" he demanded in a sharp voice. "The dragoman, your highness, is a traitor," said the man. Kāra's nervousness suddenly subsided. He became composed in demeanor, and his voice grew soft. "Explain, if you please," said he. The man bowed. "Arriving at his hotel, Tadros sent away your excellency's carriage. Where is it now?" "I do not know. Then he engaged another equipage, that of the Arab named Efter Marada, bearing the number of 93. Tadros brought the young lady down and placed her in Efter's carriage, ordering him to drive to the opera house. I sprang up behind and accompanied them. Tadros soon got rid of Efter by sending him on an errand, and then drove quickly away. He crossed the Nile to the west embankment and drove down the river to a point opposite the island of Rhoda, where your dragoman placed the lady on board a dahabeah." "Yes, go on." "When the boat steamed away up the river, I took the deserted carriage and drove here as rapidly as possible. That is all, your excellency." "Whose dahabeah was it?" "That belonging to Winston Bey. I saw him on board." "Did you see anyone else?" "The lady who has been a friend to Miss Consinor. That is Mrs. Everingham. And an old Englishman, Lord Roane." "Ah, quite a family party. And our dear Tadros went with them?" "He did, your excellency." "Up the river, you say?" "Yes, your excellency." "Thank you. You may retire." Kāra turned to Ebbek. "Put out the lights and send the servants to their quarters," he said calmly. In his room the prince tore off the white gloves and changed from evening dress to a grey travelling suit. Then he returned to the now deserted courtyard and sat down in the moonlight beside the fountain to smoke a cigar. The blow had been sharp and sudden. While Kāra fully realized the natural capability of Tadros for deception and double-dealing, he also knew that the blustering dragoman was an arrant coward, and so was bewildered at the courage manifested in his treachery. But it was characteristic of Kāra that he neither bemoaned his adverse fortune nor became despondent. He entertained a passing regret that he had delayed killing the dragoman, but did not permit himself to dwell long upon his servant's defection. The thing to be first sought was a remedy for the apparent failure of his carefully laid plans. By and by he would attend to the dragoman's reward. Just now it was imperative to prevent his intended victims from succeeding in their attempt to escape. There was no demand for immediate action. The dahabeah was, as he knew, a slow steamer, and would be forced to breast the Nile current sluggishly. His enemies doubtless depended for their safety from pursuit upon Kāra's supposed ignorance of their whereabouts. He admitted that someone had plotted shrewdly against him. On the Nile a party in a small boat is almost as isolated as if at sea. The express steamers and tourist steamers pass now and then, but they travel rapidly, appearing and disappearing within the brief space of half an hour. Aside from these, only the native barges, picturesque and ghost-like as they drift by, break the ripples of the broad river. The banks are sprinkled with many villages, and at this season shadoof workers are plentiful. But the native has tired of staring at the Nile flotilla, unless waiting with eagerness the landing of the big tourist steamer, from whose passengers a scant livelihood is gained, and this occurs only at certain points of interest. So Kāra had time to deliberate. It even occurred to him that this seeming calamity might turn out to be exceptionally favourable to the success of his schemes. In Cairo one must act with circumspection, because the police of the city are alert and almost incorruptible. The Nile dwellers fear the law rather than respect it, but they are too far from the capital to be very much afraid. Where tourists disembark, a mounted officer is stationed to lash the imprudent villagers into a state of dull apathy, such as the caged tiger feels for its trainer. But they lapse into savagery when his back is turned, and in the more unfrequented villages the sheikh is absolute king. Kāra considered carefully these conditions, and soon formed new plans to complete his vengeance. Then, the cigar being finished, he went to bed and slept until daybreak. "I shall be absent for several days," he said to Ebbek, as he ate an early breakfast. "See that everything is in perfect order when I return. If tradesmen come to demand money, promise them payment immediately on my arrival in Cairo." "Yes, my master." He caught the morning train for Luxor, and arrived by noon at a station opposite the native village of Beni Hassan, whence he crossed the river in a small boat. The children of Hassan have for centuries been known as the bandits of the Nile, and their 3 connected villages, lying close to the river bank, have replaced those that were totally destroyed by the government during the reign of Muhammad Ali, in the hope of scattering the tribes and breaking up their thieving propensities. But the Beni Hassans rebuilt their mud dwellings and calmly remained in possession. Today they are cautiously avoided by isolated tourists, who are fully warned of their evil reputation. As he landed, Kāra found the villages seemingly deserted. Underneath the tall palms at the right, a few swathed figures lay motionless, while small black goats and stray chickens wandered listlessly about. But the visitor paid little attention to these signs. He knew the old men and women were swarming in the huts, while the younger men were away at the distant tombs in the hills, or engaged in earning a stipend at the neighboring shadoofs. Turning to the left, he followed a path leading up a slight incline to a low bluff covered with a second grove of stately palms, beneath the shade of which the better dwellings of Beni Hassan have been built. He had never been in the village before, but had heard it described innumerable times since his boyhood. Even when he paused before an extensive building having cane and mud walls and a roof of palm leaves, he was fairly certain he had correctly guessed the location of the place he sought. "Does Sheikh Antar live here?" he asked a child that came out to stare at him. The little one nodded and ran within. Kāra sat down cross-legged upon the path of baked mud, removed both his shoes and placed them beside him, and then patiently awaited his reception. After some 5 minutes, a gigantic Arab bent his head to emerge from the low doorway, and after a calm but shrewd glance at his visitor, came forward and stood before Kāra. "Allahu Akbar," he said, spreading wide his arms in greeting. "The stranger is welcome to all that I possess." "May Allah bless and guard the habitation of the mighty sheikh," responded Kāra in purest Arabic. Then the sheikh sat cross-legged upon the ground, facing his guest, and also removed his red morocco slippers. His beard was grey, and his eyes black and piercing. His frame was lean, and the flesh hard as iron, denoting great strength. He wore the green turban that proved he had made the Mecca pilgrimage. "It pleases me that I behold the mighty Sheikh Antar, beloved of Allah, and the curse of all enemies of the Prophet," began Kāra after a brief silence, during which the men eyed each other earnestly. "My brother speaks well," was the grave reply. "Yet so lost am I in wonder at the glory and honor conferred upon my humble home by his presence, that the exalted name of my guest escapes my fickle memory." Kāra bowed to the ground. "I am of Gabel Abu Feda, the grandson of the Princess Hatatcha, and descended from the line of Adka Ra, and the royal kings of ancient Egypt. My name is Kāra." With dignified gesture the sheikh extended his hand and clasped that of the stranger. "The fame of the last great Egyptian has already reached my ears," said he. "Rashid, the Syrian dragoman, whose boat, the Rameses, was here but 3 days since, told me of your life in Cairo, of your magnificence and vast riches, of your generosity and wisdom. Fedah I know, for the Sheikh of Al-Kusiyeh is my comrade. The glory of Kāra the Egyptian is reflected upon every dweller upon the Nile bank." After another pause to permit of due and deliberate appreciation of this compliment, Kāra drew a heavy sigh and responded: "Yet all is not at peace with me, most noble Antar. My enemies oppress me and cause me much sorrow. Wherefore I am driven to appeal to my brother for aid." The eyes of the sheikh sparkled. "Already," said he, "confusion has fallen upon Kāra's foes, for they surely cannot escape the blight of Antar's hatred." "Then see how gratitude flows from my heart like a very cataract," answered the other, with downcast eyes. "It is little that Kāra can do to repay such brotherly love, but the great sheikh must distribute for me 10,000 piastres to his worthy poor, even on that day when my enemies are confounded." Antar's brow was thoughtful. A great payment meant a great service. "My brother will tell me a story," said he, "and I will listen." Thereupon, in the flowery language of Arabia, which English words but feebly translate, the Egyptian told of a boat steaming slowly up the Nile and bearing his enemies toward the village of Beni Hassan. He described the women and the men, and noticed that the sheikh grunted with discouraging emphasis when Winston Bey's name was mentioned. Then, following out the idea of relating a tale, Kāra told how his brother, the almighty Sheikh Antar, fell upon the dahabeah and captured it, turning over all the passengers and crew to Kāra except one, Tadros the dragoman being unfortunately killed and dropped overboard to find a final resting place in the mud at the river's bottom. Then Winston's crew was replaced by 6 strong men of Beni Hassan, who obeyed Kāra's commands as willingly as if they proceeded from Antar himself. And Kāra afterwards steamed up the Nile to Fedah, with the sheikh on board, and at Fedah gave to him not only the 10,000 piastres for his poor, but many gems of fabulous worth for his personal adornment and that of his women. Was it not a pretty story? He concluded. And did it not sound like a prophecy in Antar's discerning ears? The sheikh considered long and earnestly. He did not like meddling with Winston Bey, whom he knew of old and respected highly. But Kāra's allusion to the gems was irresistible, and Antar might discover a way to keep from being recognized by the scientist. It required several hours to conclude the bargain, but at last both men thoroughly understood the details of the service that was required and must be rendered. The assault upon the dahabeah was discussed and planned, and the terms of payment agreed upon. The killing of Tadros was an incident that the sheikh accepted without demur. With 2 clever rascals, such as the Egyptian and the Arab in charge of the raid, there seemed little hope that Winston Bey's unsuspecting party could escape absolute destruction. End of chapter 20.